And we're live.
We're live.
Hello. Welcome back to the Footnotes podcast, where we go over the footnotes of our week. This is number 7. I think we're getting a lot more comfortable now. We're just getting right into it without any warm up. So let's just go. So June, I always ask you, what's been going on?
I think things are picking up at school. I've noticed things are moving fairly quickly. And I don't know, this week's been kind of a blur. I've been rushing to prepare for tutorials, which are like group learning sessions, going to different classes. And then this weekend we had a Blue Mountain retreat.
Ooh.
So I just got back from that. As soon as we got back from that, I had a quartet performance for Supercrawl downtown.
Nice. How'd it go?
It went okay. Not as
Okay.
well as we'd hoped.
What does that mean?
Not as well as we rehearsed.
I see.
But the performance is always going to be different. And then immediately after, upon my suggestion, we went to all-you-can-eat sushi. And I've applied my years and years of all-you-can-eat training to this day. Because over the weekend, like my ketogenic diet leash, I've kind of unleashed myself, and so I've been going crazy past few days.
You eating a lot of carb?
Oh yeah, just 4 ice cream, today for dessert.
Is this
Anyway, yeah.
is this like good for you? Like, do you feel at least mentally well? I don't know what it's doing to you physically.
Like I don't probably not good for me in the medium to long term, but tonight was all about a short-term reward, and I've achieved that.
Very nice.
Yeah.
I similarly achieved some short-term rewards this weekend as well.
All right.
Well, I was in Hamilton actually.
Really?
Yeah. Quinn, one of my housemates, he invited me to go to Hoko. We didn't even
Oh.
go to Hoko. We
Yeah.
just went to like a small party that Io, the other housemate, knew about, and we went, and it was the night that I drank the most in my life, and I felt fantastic. I felt like I took shots. I was doing all the beers. That's how it works. I did a shotgun. Shotgun.
All right.
It was quite the experience. It was very. It made me feel very full very quickly, and I almost threw up, but I didn't because I really wanted to persevere. I think I've trained myself.
Full of what?
Sorry? Oh, full of just like air and like beer and oh.
Good stuff.
Have you shotgunned a beer before?
No.
Oh, you haven't had the experience.
No.
I wouldn't recommend it, but if you're willing to try, I'll show you the ropes. I'm practically a master at this point, but
yeah.
I definitely don't recommend. Yeah. But yeah, so I had some short-term rewards there. Had a terrible night of sleep. Got here, I was slept all the way here, but now I feel good. So sometimes, like you just gotta focus on the short term. Enjoy life. It's not a long. You don't get a lot of time on this planet, so might as well enjoy it. I'm sure this would go well if we, perpetuated this idea to our patients. Yeah, actually, I wanted to ask you about that a little bit too. Like, what do you think? How do you think our lifestyles will reflect on our patient care? Do you think they're going to be completely separate, like our personal lives and the recommended lives that we give to patients?
Well, I mean, yeah, we were having this discussion, like actually exactly along these lines, because we were talking about social media this week, and at Mac, we have a class weekly called Professional Competencies, or ProCom, where we
Right.
discuss issues like social media and professionalism, ethics, and whatever issues that are pertinent.
Mm.
And I think some of the ideas that got tossed around included the idea that the border between our professional lives and personal lives may be blurring because of
Mm.
social media and how easily we can upload photos and experiences, or others can do so of us, and
Mm.
how patients might be able to access that. So, yeah, and I think what came out of the discussion was the feeling that as if you're going to become physicians, you can't completely separate your personal life from your professional life. That
Mm.
how you act in your personal life is also going to be a reflection to some degree of your, let's say, virtue or character as a professional.
Right. And well, part of the reason why I bring it up is because I just told everyone on this social media that I
Yeah.
shotgunned the drink this weekend, and that
Uh-huh.
I drank a lot of beer and and took shots. So that's definitely something to be cautious about, I'm sure.
Uh-huh.
But does that make me any less of a competent physician? Does that make me um, less trustworthy? What does that do for my image? These are questions that I've had, and like you said, it's hard to perfectly split the professional side and the personal side, especially with social media and such. But I'm wondering, should that really be something we have to take into account? Like, how much responsibility do we need to take over that?
Mhm. Well, I mean, to the degree that it's in our control, we probably should take control.
Hmm.
I mean, for example, if you post a picture of you shotgunning a beer on like Facebook, and have some wildly inappropriate comment that goes along with it, like that's probably not the best idea.
Hmm.
Um, as for like how what you say on a YouTube live stream, how that might be perceived, probably the audience isn't going to be as wide, or this segment of you speaking isn't going to be as easily accessible. Uh,
Right.
so I don't think your degree of, let's say, responsibility, or the amount that you have to be careful about, I don't think that's too high.
Mm.
But still, people will receive it how they want to,
Mm.
right? If I was your patient, for example, and I heard you saying this, I might find you more relatable and normal. Like, you know, yeah, this guy enjoys drinks with his friends. Like, good for him. That's like
Right.
perfectly socially acceptable. Maybe if I was a bit more judgmental, I could say, wow, how could he drink any alcohol at all? That's so, he should be like the perfect, guy on a pedestal for being healthy. But I,
Well, that was, yeah.
mhm,
That latter part was my perspective like 4 years ago. So, like, I can see it happening in other people as well.
yeah.
Um, this also ties in with something that happened to me this weekend. So I was just walking through campus, going to the gym, and there were people on campus that pulled me aside to ask me questions. Like, they had a mic and they had a camera and everything,
Oh,
and they said, "Can I ask you a few questions?" And I'm like, "Sure," not asking what it was about or anything like that, which I should have. And it turned out they were part of the Animal Liberation Alliance in London.
interesting.
Uh, so what their aims are, is to reduce and maybe eliminate um, the unfair treatment of animals, and perhaps even just the consumption of animals in general. I didn't look in too deeply into what their platform is, but anyhow, the experience that I had was very unique. So obviously, when someone asks you questions on campus like that, and they're part of some organization, there's somewhat of an agenda going on, right? So the whole time I was trying to be as non bipartisan as possible, trying to take a very like moderate role and making sure that I wasn't like being led to saying specific things.
Yeah.
And I think some of watching some videos of like Jordan Peterson and things like that really helped, because you got to be very careful about what you say and how people lead you on. But I had a pretty decent conversation, and I got to talk to them afterwards and ask them about their views. And now I think what I'm waiting for is for it to be published. They said it might be on YouTube. So I don't have much else to say about that. But sorry?
You'd be on YouTube if you were exciting enough to get airtime.
Yes.
Yeah. If you're
right. Which I don't know if I was, but we'll see. If they publish it, I'm curious to see how they portray it and how my words were used. But I will follow up with you on that. But that was just an interesting experience I had this weekend. I thought it'd be interesting to share.
Well, what did you say?
In terms of like how did I answer the questions?
Yeah.
Well, so the questions weren't like, would you eat animals or would you not eat animals or things like that. The questions were the sorts of questions that asked, for example, when people see a plate full of food or a plate with like meat on it, do you think that people think that as an animal? So if you have like pork on a plate, do you think, oh, that's a pig, I am eating pig? I answered, you probably don't make that association. You don't think it's like alive, or even that it used to be a live animal when you're eating it. And there was no judgment or criticism with regard to my question. She was just like asking this as, just exploring what my thoughts were. Yeah, what else? I think another question was, do you think eating meat is necessary? And I was tempted to say, it depends on what you mean by necessary. But I didn't go down that route. It depends. Like people would have different views on this depending on their value system or what they thought was important in their life. So again, trying to be as moderate as possible. I don't think I said anything crazy, and I was acutely aware that this could fire back at me if I said the wrong thing and if it popped up later. But yeah, very interesting. The first time it's happened to me, I just went along with it, and it felt kind of natural too, which was cool.
I guess you have enough talking practice on camera.
Yeah, this has helped.
The first big media appearance.
Yeah. Well, I'll follow up with you in a week and see if I become famous overnight.
Mm-hmm. See, that's one thing that does strike me about how many people debate things about our diet. In some ways, it's so basic, so fundamental to everyone. Like I've been noticing this more and more as I started the keto diet. When I first started it and started researching it and getting into it and trying to adopt it into my life, I assumed it would be this obscure thing that people don't really know about. But yeah, most of the people that I've talked to, at least in my university circle, excluding my parents, but even some of my parents' friends, they've all heard of this keto diet, and they all seem to have, at least knowledge of it, or know someone who's tried it, or have very strong opinions for or against it. It's been a very strange experience to me. I think we're divided in terms of diet and what we eat and how we eat, and the ethical considerations that go into such a practical human universal like food and diet. But yeah, I've been just so surprised at how many people have opinions about it and how easy it is to talk to like anyone about my diet. Like everyone seems to take an interest in it, which is
Right.
interesting.
That's a really interesting observation. And like, for example, like no one talks about, well, people don't often talk about sleep as much as they talk about food, I think. Like you don't talk about how to sleep or like what position you should assume when you sleep to get the best result. Yeah. The most you talk about is like hours of sleep, but food, I think food may be different domains like economics, agriculture, et cetera, science, you know, so it's so complicated.
I don't know. I feel as though there's a sentiment that what we've inherited as the dominant diet, like we've been fed the wrong things. And
What do you mean?
we've been fed the wrong things in terms of if you've been following the like Canada's food guide or the North American diet,
Right.
you don't end up in good places. So I sense that there's a general distrust or a something like a curiosity to explore alternative ways, and it's been interesting to talk to people. Really anyone, even people that I would have time like a hard time connecting with otherwise. If you talk about food, you can everyone's opinionated. Yeah.
Interesting. I particularly like the topic of food because, you know, I like making food too. It's not just about eating; it's also about making. I don't know if you've had as a similar experience, being able to connect with people about making food. There seems to be like you're either really interested in making food or you're really not interested in making food. That's the experience that I've had so far. Like when people know about how to make food, they just know so much. And they've had so many experiences and they've had like, family traditions, family recipes passed down.
Yeah.
They've got this host of knowledge. And I've just talked to people who are like, oh yeah, I just, throw some eggs in a pan and throw some vegetables and just eat that every day. And they don't care, or they just buy food. So that's also kind of interesting as well.
Yeah, no, I think you bring up a good point. I think making, preparing, storing, and sharing food has always been a big big part of our cultural traditions. It's always something that brought people together. So that was one of the key ideas of a center I worked in. I worked for an organization called Community Food Centers Canada, of which there are many, and the idea is it's the evolution of something like a food bank. If a food bank is a place where people who don't have enough to eat go to be hand down, to receive handouts of usually cheap and nutritionally insufficient foods. If that's the food bank model, the community food center model is something that's more holistic, something that aims to provide very high quality, healthy food in low income neighborhoods. And they've seen that you could really use food as a tool to help build communities. So there's not only the act of sharing food together, like sitting down and eating good food while facing one another, which is a practice that's, I think slowly been disappearing in our culture. Not only is that there that aspect, but they also have community gardens where people can grow food together and through that produce take cooking lessons or other classes where they can uh, learn these skills together.
Mm.
And one major problem that they've identified is that um, most families and most kids growing up these days don't have access to, especially in lower income neighborhoods where people are busier, access to supermarkets or fresh foods, or like, it's very difficult in terms of transportation, distance, and even just time, the time to make food. That's kind of all disappearing. So
Mm.
that's like a major part of our cultural fabric that's been disintegrating. Um, and I think that's another part of the picture in terms of why people find food so important.
Mm.
Or yeah, that was my rant on food.
That's really interesting. I particularly like the idea the sitting in front of each other and eating,
Yeah.
and making it a sort of a social experience, um, sort of a bonding experience. I don't know what it is about that action that is so conducive to bonding.
Mhm.
I guess it provides the opportunity for you to have conversation, which is even better. But like sometimes I eat with my family and we don't really talk, but we're sitting together, we're sharing a meal, we're spending time together, and that's enough,
Yeah.
right? There's like nonverbal communication that we're in this together, we're getting nourished together or something like that,
Mhm.
um, and it's a nice experience. So I'm wondering even about the applications of this, because obviously community food centers are making this a big part of their social development or social movement. I'm not sure what to call it, but can we translate this into like medicine even? Like, can it be applied? Can it be a medical uh, recommendation to have food with your kids or to spend more time with your kids? Um, to better their health and even to better the health of the parents as well. you
Mhm.
know these sorts of things I think maybe getting more traction nowadays with the rise of social determinants of health, that something like this would actually be a medical recommendation.
Mhm. Yeah, I do think there was an article maybe last year, a couple of years ago. I'm getting really bad feedback. I'm hearing my own voice.
Oh, okay, let me see if I can fix that real quick.
All right. So, what was I saying? Yeah, there was an article I saw a couple of years ago about doctors in the States and maybe even in Canada prescribing food bank vouchers or uh, grocery food stamps, essentially. So that's starting to get at that idea. But yeah, I think there is that emerging idea. If you can, prescribe something like a meal with a family or shared experience, that hits at a lot of those social determinants, which I think food is really at the core of. So if you can get relatively fresh, healthy food, and I don't know if you can prescribe a recipe, but also provide the means and tools to prepare that food and then share that food with your family. Like that's a simple step that can be very powerful. Uh, like obviously there are limitations. So for example, if you're a single mother with 3 kids working 2 part-time jobs, you're not necessarily gonna have time to prepare, a full-on dinner every night. And that's where like social, let's say, assistant structures like community food centers might play a role. But I think inevitably, if you want to start addressing some of the social elements that are involved in health, like social cohesion, um, you're going to have to make some of those recommendations and develop them further into the future.
um, I don't have much else to say. I think it's a fairly cool topic, and I'm sure there's a lot of research going on as well. Um, Maybe that's something we can be more educated about, and we can continue the dialogue in future weeks. But if you had any other points,
I mean, the thing about that is, I don't know about other people, but for me, like someone in global health, and I'm sure many health students of health-related topics too, like this is very old news, right? Or this is, I think this idea of social determinants, and the idea that there is so much more to health than what medicine and healthcare can currently provide. I think that idea has been like thoroughly beaten into. Now I think it's more about how do you apply these things? How do you make policy changes, or
right?
or how do you encourage, or how do you what, cultivate cultural changes that will allow for these to happen better? Yeah. That's all I have to say.
We know the theory. Now it's time to put it into practice. Right. I'm very hopeful. I think very optimistic. So, just want to move on maybe because we are about halfway maybe. Anything else that's been coming up this week? Any interesting news? Any drama?
I mean, there's always drama. But
there's always drama.
Maybe not for this podcast.
Okay, sounds good.
Did you have anything else?
Yeah, well, I did have something that I wanted to bring up. So this week, so we have this course in our Schulich Med program that's sort of like inquiry that you would see in Health Sci. So it's called PCCIA, and it's a small group session where we most of the time discuss specific topics. And this week, the topic was eugenics, more specifically antenatal screening for certain like genetic disorders, and then basically deciding whether or not, you know, a mother or the father would want to abort a baby that is likely or at high risk of developing a disease. So there were a couple of articles that we were assigned to read, and we read them and we discussed it. So the structure of the class that day was a debate, and you had to decide. We randomly assigned the pros and the cons side of the eugenics argument, eugenics debate. And I personally had a very interesting. So I wanted to go in and I wanted to stir the pot as much as possible, because I knew our group was very vocal, but they were willing to agree with each other on a lot of things, and they were very moderate. They are very moderate, and they're willing to say, okay, well, there's this consideration, and stuff like that. So one of the questions I posed in the middle was, during the middle of the argument was, so does anyone has anyone actually chosen a side? And a couple people were able to answer, and a couple people, they both chose to be on the side of not eugenics, but antenatal screening, and potentially, I guess, abortion for children or fetuses who are at high risk for developing serious disease. And then it devolved into sort of an abortion argument. What I wanted to actually talk about was my personal experience, which was a lot of resentment for some reason throughout the whole experience. Mm-hmm. So when I hear these moderate views, and when I hear people with these solid arguments for in the moderate perspective. For some reason, I feel a level of contempt. I think it might be. I feel like personally, I go through the thought of, okay, well, they're not really taking a stance. They're not really saying anything. They're just walking on a thin line. They're trying not to offend. They're not, stuff like that. So I personally had a lot of frustration, I think maybe is the best word to use, when hearing other people's viewpoints. And this is ironic and paradoxical because I personally also use moderate standpoints, so I don't offend anyone, or I don't get perceived as anyone that's too extreme. So I wanted to unpack this, and I wanted to get your insight, maybe, or perspective on this, as to why I would feel a certain level of contempt for others when they're presenting a moderate view. Why that might be. I have a few theories, but I wanted to get your first impression on
that. The first thing I thought of was something like, it's probably the first or second week of classes for you guys.
Mm-hmm.
And in that situation, I don't know how big the class is, but in those new social situations, it's better to be conservative with your views rather than
Right.
Show all your cards.
Mm-hmm.
That's probably the main explanation as to why you may feel frustrated because of that. Perhaps
So
you
like they're not opening up, they're not actually being honest. Is that sort of the idea?
I would think so, that maybe you're frustrated because you think that they all have a mask, and they're not being as genuine as they could be with their views. Maybe you recognize a part of them that you don't like in you, of being, let's say, withdrawing of your true feelings and views, and that's something I'm totally guilty of myself. And I feel the same thing in my professional competencies class. Of if only I were more articulate with, or more courageous, then I could really say what I believe. So maybe there's a frustration related to yourself. So those are the kind of things that you made me think
I think that the last part, what you said, really rings true, because another thing that I want to say is that when I was preparing for this class, I was preparing arguments for and against, but I found that the arguments that I prepared were in contrast to very extreme arguments on both sides. So I had prepared all these arguments for and against, the pro and con arguments that were very extreme, right? And so there was a very clear reason why those other arguments were wrong. It seemed like none of those came up during the discussion. And so perhaps another level of frustration was I had prepared to demolish and destroy all these other arguments that would have been super extreme and nonsensical. And, I would have gone in there and I would have been able to actually formulate a very strong argument, and I don't know, be very articulate and whatnot. And that didn't happen, right? And it was so much harder to navigate through these moderate viewpoints and to figure out ways to go against them, or to be critical of them, because they were so safe and so careful. So I think a part of the frustration must have been that I was just an incompetent debater, or just very ill prepared to deal with the complexity of the issue, and that made me frustrated. Yeah.
I notice in myself too, when I'm in those kind of situations, that I keep wanting to identify an enemy. Like, it would make things so much easier for me if there was like a personification of everything I hated and every view I detested and thought was illogical, just in one person, that I could just, you know, point them out and say, "Ha, you're wrong. Here's why I'm right." And here's that it makes me a better person than you. And that's so tempting and so, you know, even satisfying to think about, right? And I keep wanting to label some of my classmates in those ways during certain discussions when there are contentious issues involved. So for example, like, if I sense that some of their argumentation involve views from a political stance that I don't particularly agree with, then there's something in me that wants to identify just that person as being of that, um, let's say, series of or pattern of views that I detest. And that would make things so much more simpler. That would make my life much simpler. But the thing is, like, each person and myself included is such a convoluted web of related and non-related ideas, that it's really impossible to mark someone as enemy or threat and then dispose of their ideas, um, especially when you have very very intelligent people in one room.
Right. So, what would you say is the proactive measure against that? What is the best way to deal with that personally and interpersonally, I suppose?
I mean, to be honest, I don't have a good solution to that.
Mm,
Yeah, I don't know. I've always thought that I was an empathetic person. I've always thought that I had a capacity that was better than average in terms of imagining others' lives and perspectives more imaginatively or more complexly. I'm sure those things would help if I truly did try to practice them, or really try to radically empathize with some of their views, or try to see in myself where I hold views that I may not completely agree with. Um, but I don't know. It seems to be such a difficult process. Identifying things as threats and identifying things as enemy, like, really simplifies the world in a way that um, helps it easier for us to navigate. And that's what we do for the most part, is make things easier for us to navigate.
so, is it just a matter of experience? I almost feel like it is. Just grappling with more complex issues and being comfortable, I guess, with uncertainty, or being comfortable with that level of complexity where you can't just simplify people to one ideology or one specific viewpoint.
Mhm.
And you have to keep in your mind this constant limbo of thoughts and opinions that other people have. That's that's tough.
Mm-hmm. What might develop, so it's like our minds are trying to develop a schema for 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 placing people, for categorizing people.
Right.
And it's something like, right now our schemas of people in the world are insufficient for that. So until we have a better grasp of, like, the type of people that can exist in the world, and I think the current schemas that we have around, like, even for political position, like left and right, is like very insufficient and broad and unuseful, unproductive. That I think we're going to need to develop more sophisticated, um, and valid categorical structures that can help us, let's say, label people, but with more nuance and accuracy. And one of the ways that helps is definitely the Big Five personality model. So typing people along those dimensions helped me a little better to understand political views and where they're coming from. So, like one example is trait agreeableness. Most of us have a politically left tilt because we're in a caring profession, and that trait was also selected for during the interview process for
Right.
medicine. So I can understand why myself and others tend to take a very compassionate and caring, let's say, perspective or line of argumentation. So I think it has to do, but until we develop more, those more sophisticated mental models of truly capturing people, um, we're gonna be in chaos. It's gonna be there's gonna be a degree of complexity that always escapes us and frustrates us, but and it'll tempt us to type people along a simpler, more, let's say, regressive lines or older, outdated ways of categorizing the world.
Hmm.
But that's something we can't fall victim to.
Hmm. Well put. It's interesting that you bring up the Big Five personality model in particular. Um, I've never actually tried to use that in a practical sense. It's always been a sort of a meme for me when we talk, uh, but I've never saw the practical application of that. Maybe because it's hard for me to see the Big Five in people. When I see people, I see a holistic sort of um, interpretation or a holistic model of what that person is likely to do, like what their pattern of thought is. And I'm sure that must map on to Big Five. Like I'm sure it does, but there's a bit more nuance to it when you see it holistically, because, well, I think maybe a better way to put it is I see characters, literally characters, like in a play or in a movie or in a book, because characters do have that sort of similar level of consistency in terms of how they think and act. And so oftentimes I would meet someone and I think, okay, well, that's like a June character,
Yeah.
or that's like a Sam character, or things like that. And there are very few times where I'm unable to map that person onto a character that I've already met or already have experienced. But obviously that makes me fall victim to that generalization and that sort of simplification of that person, because
Well,
there's nuance that I'm not taking into account.
well, yes, and also not necessarily, I think.
Okay.
And what the reason I say that is I was also having a conversation with Matt, my friend Matt MacArthur. He's also in the same school with me, and I had a long conversation about him yesterday. One of the things that came up is he's a very avid reader of fiction, and he loves discussing the characters and their psychology that are written in these lengthy and great works of fiction. And I think what fiction writers do is they correctly identify like a psychological pattern and embody that in a character that is real and believable. And the best character is going to be like unbelievably complex and different from one another. Um, so you know what, that a potential solution to our initial problem of um, how to develop better models of people might be to engage in very high quality fiction. It's like, so a June character in your life, or do you know a Sam character, but there's going to be other characters that whose lives and experiences you'll have essentially zero access to. And what fiction allows us to do, or what other great authors can convey us to us, is that whole package of complexity and different perspectives that we've never considered before. So perhaps by engaging in fiction, we would be better able to typecast the different um, types of people in the world. And I think that's like that's such a innate drive in us to categorize the world and categorize the people in it. Like you see this all the time with, I know astrology is like very huge in even our current culture, in Western culture, or in Korea and Japan. Um, even after, even in the most scientifically advanced Asian nations, like people love blood types, and the different personality models that go with the different blood types.
Yeah.
It's like such a deep rooted meme that just doesn't seem to go away, no matter how irrational it is, because it's something so fundamental that we need to do, and that it's a flawed schema, but it still has the effect of making our complex lives more manageable, or at least seemingly more manageable to digest and understand. So I think there is this a need to better understand characters and their motivations. And like the Big Five model might be like a very rigorous and scientific way of going about that, but even more than that, characters, their motivations, their personalities, I think that's encapsulated in great fiction, and I should probably read more fiction if I want to be better in pro comp and with empathizing with the perspectives of others and engaging with them.
Hmm. Very interesting. I wanted to ask you what you meant by engaging in fiction, but you answered that question. You literally mean go and read more books.
Yes.
Go and read more fictional books. Yeah, and get educated about these complex psychological. What would you call them? Psychological
Tropes, personalities.
tropes. Right.
Mhm.
Very interesting. Now, I want to ask you too. Does it have to be through fiction? Why is fiction? Is it because it's so easily accessible and it gives a very, I guess, insider look into what people think and what these characters think and what they do, or is there something special about fiction in particular that we can't get from, conversing with people and thinking about our interactions with people and how they think, how they act, and things like that? What is better, fiction or nonfiction in that sense?
Well, I mean, you can't really say which one is better. The stories from both fiction and not fiction, you know, life can be stranger than fiction, or fiction can be great. Like I'll give you one example. So during this wellness weekend at Blue Mountain, we had a speaker, and she was a very important oncologist, um, who was working in Sudbury, but she was also has big leadership positions in clinical trials throughout Ontario and Cancer Care Ontario. So there's this, she's gone through a lot of difficult things in her life, including her own mother getting breast cancer and going through the process of that. And the kind of the pinnacle of the story that she told that day was, so she was getting married, and she had planned for months, and um, her bridesmaids included a lot of the medical students that she met during university, a lot of residents, and it was this great community affair, and everyone was there in a beautiful lodge in Muskoka, and everyone was having a great time. And that night, her father suffered a massive heart attack. So in the wedding hall, they had to run a code blue, in a room of like 50 doctors. Um, but eventually they were all performing CPR on him, but he had to get into an ambulance. So it was her in her wedding dress, and a few other doctors that got into the ambulance with her, and they were performing CPR, but after 30 minutes, it was unsuccessful. So that oncologist lady was the one in her wedding dress who had to make the call that they should stop CPR, and let her father go. And when she got off the ambulance, she was the one who had to explain to her mother and her sister, who have never seen or witnessed a death before, that their father had died. So, like, that is an incredible story, and she tied that back to all the lessons about resilience she had learned in her life, and how she applied those lessons in order to, she had only booked the day off just one day after her wedding, 1 or 2 days, and in that time, in that span of time, she arranged the funeral, she got everything organized. She didn't, let go of her responsibility to her patients because her clinic was fully booked on the Tuesday. So she still managed to contact all the people and get them seen. So that was a big, let's say, example or learning story in resilience and the responsibility of a physician. And like, this is a, let's say, a conspiring of odds that is like very unlikely to happen to someone, but it did. So in these ways, nonfiction can be incredibly powerful, as and memorable. Uh, in this way, nonfiction can be stranger than fiction, and that was a really powerful story that I'll really remember. Um, but back to the original point about it's a nonfiction or fiction, truly incredible, and things can happen in nonfiction. In fiction, the, let's say, advantage is that the author has a kind of blank slate, anything can happen, kind of world in which to recreate the characters that he's been developing or witnessing in his own life, and to try to condense them or modify them in a way that is, let's say, you can push the extremes a little bit more, right, with fiction. It makes the diversity and impact of stories that you can tell much more broad. So in both ways, I think the stories and characters from both nonfiction and fiction are um, powerful, but the strength of fictions are that you're not going to encounter a nonfiction as powerful as the story of that oncologist every day. Whereas in fiction, if you so choose, you can be exposed to these kind of powerful stories at any
Right.
time.
Right. Well said. Yeah, thank you for sharing that story. And thank you to the doctor who also shared that story. Yeah, it's something I think, medical students, or just, I think people in general should always hear about. In moderation, of course, because I'm sitting here emotionally drained already from listening to it. We had a similar sort of welcome to medicine story in our school as well, by our Dr. George Kim, and yeah, he was talking about his personal experience. I can briefly talk about it. Essentially, he was a resident at the time. I think it was residency, and he had suffered. Was it a concussion, or he had incurred some sort of brain injury that prevented him from continuing his residency training, and he had to delay it for 2 years because of that injury. And he also couldn't do some of the professions that he was interested in. For example, I think it was emergency medicine, because he could no longer, like, he couldn't be in that sort of scenario. It just wasn't good for him physically. And when he told that story, it was eye-opening. And Yeah, I personally find nonfiction a lot more powerful than fiction. Um, Perhaps it's because oftentimes nonfiction it's tied to a real person, and they're able to deliver that through speech and through, I guess, movies and such could parody or portray fiction in a way that's nonfiction, but definitely, I think if you're able to relate to the person and relate to the character, you're able to get a very deep reading out of it and learn some important lessons. So um, I think I don't know how to follow up. I think maybe one thing to take away from this is, yeah, learn more stories or hear more stories, experience more stories in any way that you can. I think you and I were very much interested in stories, um, and we learn a lot from them. So I hope we can keep sharing them and learning from them. Yeah. Um, I feel like that's a great way to just conclude this podcast. Um, did you have anything else that you wanted to bring up? Can you top that?
No, I don't think I should.
Well, that's great. Yeah. So I guess I never know how to end these things, especially when I'm so emotionally engaged. But thanks for listening, and we'll be back next week, hopefully with a few more stories of our own. So take care.